30 years ago, replacement theory was the repellent fever dream of a jokey, also-ran Russian fascist politician. It was dismissed by almost everyone. Today, it is a juggernaut, driving right-wing politics the world over. It leads to violence and ethnic cleansing, to mass shootings. And now, almost a year to the day since Tucker Carlson gave it legs on American television, this murderous conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement is now mainstream within the Republican Party. 7 months out from perhaps the most consequential midterm elections of our lives, what will it take to turn the far-right tide? And how many more lives might this vicious replacement libel take in the meantime? Let's bring in Peter Beinart, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents and author of Beinart Notebook on Substack. We also have Nicole Hemmer, associate research scholar at Columbia University and author of Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics, and Tara Setmeyer, a former Republican communications director who left the party in 2020 and is now a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project. Thank you all for joining me. Nicole, let me start with you. Would replacement theory be the rallying cry it has become for American conservatives today, without Fox, without Tucker Carlson hawking it to his audience night after night? Talk to me a bit about the sheer power of a Tucker Carlson to change the discourse both in right-wing circles and in America more broadly.
Well, he's a very important mainstreaming figure because he has such a large audience, right? He's the most watched show on cable news, and it has the imprimatur of Fox News, which in right-wing circles these days is actually seen as a more centrist or even more liberal alternative to something like Newsmax or OAN. And so he does have this megaphone, but we should be clear that he's not the only one carrying this message. Even without Tucker Carlson, this is a message that has been a big part of radicalized right-wing politics increasingly over the past 30 years, not just in Russia, but Pat Buchanan and Peter Brimlow in the early 1990s were pushing a lot of this same rhetoric.
Yes. They were, and I don't think any of us ever imagined how mainstream it would get. Tara, here's GOP Congressman Scott Perry in a House Foreign Affairs hearing last April, just days after Tucker Carlson first pushed the Great Replacement on his show. Have a listen.
For many Americans, what seems to be happening, or what they believe right now is happening, is what appears to them is we're replacing national-born American, native-born Americans to permanently transform the political landscape of this very nation.
Tara, is it fair to say the Republican Party has become a white supremacist party at this point?
I would say they've certainly mainstreamed voices of white supremacy that were never acceptable in the past. Back decades ago, when you started to see these more extremist, racist ideologies bubble up in the Republican Party, from the John Birch Society, et cetera, David Duke, they were shunned. Now you see this being mainstreamed by, right-wing talking heads on the most popular network in the country, and seemingly silence from Republican leadership. Where is Mitch McConnell on this? Where is Kevin McCarthy? Yeah. Where are these people while you have their caucus espousing these things, going on programs and podcasts that are espousing these despicable, I would say, yes, white supremacist and domestic terrorist level ideologies. I mean, the FBI talked about that, right-wing extremism is the #1 domestic terrorism threat to the United States. And here you have what's considered a mainstream cable news channel with its top host espousing this on a nightly basis. It's dangerous, and it's part of this trend of illiberalism and this trend toward autocracy that the Republican Party has taken, which is why I decided to leave it.
Yeah, and it's a trend that's centered a great deal around the southern border, around black and brown people coming into America. Tucker Carlson talks openly about his animosity towards such people. But there's always, Peter, the ancient hatred, the oldest hatred underlying all of it. And I want to play a bit of what the Unite the Right ralliers chanted in their 2017 march in Charlottesville. Have a listen.
Do not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
Peter, those protesters covered the distance between "you will not replace us" and "Jews will not replace us" very fast. And we've seen the damage done by the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter the following year. How does this replacement theory so often end up targeting Jews?
It's important to remember what happened in Pittsburgh. The shooter in Pittsburgh started out being radicalized by Fox News and this idea that there was an invasion of brown people coming across the southern border. But the thing is, because racists believe that black and brown people are inferior, they don't believe that they can organize themselves. And that's where Jews come in, because the stereotype of Jews is different. It's of the kind of the sinister genius behind the scenes. And so what this guy in Pittsburgh decided it was Jews, Soros, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, that were actually organizing this invasion, this replacement of white people in the United States. And it's in that way that this racism towards black and brown immigrants ultimately becomes violence against Jews. It's actually an old story. If you look at segregationist literature during the Civil Rights Movement, because the segregationists were racists who didn't think black people could organize a movement for freedom, they would always say it was the Jewish communists who were behind it. And in this way, this idea actually threatens not only black and brown people, but it threatens Jews, some of whom are black and brown and some of whom are white.
Yeah, and you would think that anti-Semitism would be something that, we can all agree that's out of bounds. That was a taboo for a long time. But no, Nicole, for a long time, we thought Lachlan Murdoch, son of Fox News owner Rupert Murdoch, he might be a moderating influence on the network, but he ignored an ADL letter last year calling out Carlson's anti-Semitic rhetoric. And Lachlan Murdoch just gave a speech in Australia blasting the 1619 Project, censorship by big tech of COVID conspiracy theories. I mean, he's really kind of drinking the MAGA Kool-Aid. How responsible are the Murdochs for what passes as quote-unquote discourse on the American right these days?
Oh, hugely responsible. I mean, the Fox News has acted as the communications arm of the Republican Party for at least a decade now, if not more. And that's an incredible amount of power. But I think in talking about the Murdochs, it points to the international reach of American right-wing conspiracies, because Lachlan Murdoch is speaking out against the 1619 Project and speaking out about all these different conspiracy theories in a speech that he's giving in Sydney, Australia, because the Murdoch empire is, of course, not just limited to the United States. And so you see that radicalized rhetoric, not just in the U.S., but spreading out from Fox News throughout national politics, through every reach of U.S. politics, but also internationally as well.
And Tara, I'm wondering, as someone who spent a lot of time in that party, how many of these Republicans, like your Pete Sessions, always believe this odious stuff and were just waiting for a chance to say it in public? And how many of them are just going along for the ride? People like Ted Cruz, who probably wasn't always enamored by white conspiracy theories, being the son of a Cuban immigrant. But, they see the way the wind is blowing in their party. What's the divide right now in the party between the true believers and the kind of cowards?
Well, I think the party's dominated by cowards, no question about it, because if they weren't, we wouldn't have these others that are mainstream now with so much influence in it. If the Ted Cruzes and the others who know better, the Mitch McConnells, the Kevin McCarthys, and the common sense Republicans, the more traditional Republicans that know better, if they had taken a stand and not been so politically craven, we wouldn't have the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Gosars and the Matt Gaetz and the Lauren Boeberts and the, should I keep going? Because there's a whole cadre of these people now who are the mouthpieces of the party without consequence. They're welcomed. And it's because the base now feels as though, obviously, this was an underbelly, an ugly underbelly of the Republican Party that I may have been a little more naive to than I am now, obviously, that has been now given a permission structure to say the quiet parts out loud. And it's become part of their political strategy, very front and center. And here we see what J.D. Vance has done in his desperation. J.D. Vance is the Ted Cruz of the Ohio Senate race. He'll say and do anything to try to get along and to try to, activate that white grievance to try to propel himself ahead because he's in third place. This is a guy who voted for Evan McMullin last time around, and now he's trying to cloak himself as some kind of, white replacement Tucker Carlson Trumper. People see right through it. But, this is something now that's acceptable in the Republican Party.
At least Ted Cruz can win his races. I don't think J.D. Vance is going to win his. Peter, this is a rising movement of global xenophobia, and it's not always just driven by white people. President Biden spoke Monday with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a Hindu far-right nationalist who has risen to power by warning Hindus in India that Muslims will replace them, a lie that has led to government discrimination, violent mob attacks on Muslims. How is one conspiracy theory so globally malleable, so globally popular today?
Well, I think what you have is across the world a struggle between two visions of nationhood. One in which citizenship and nationhood is based on certain ideals that are colorblind, that can be embraced by people of any religion, in which you live in a certain territory, you obey the law, and you follow a kind of colorblind ideal, and a kind of ethno-nationalist racist vision, which is exploited by politicians who appeal to people who actually have historically been on top, but fear that the hierarchies may be shifting, that they may not, their control may be being slipping away from them in some way, and then these kind of opportunistic politicians weaponize that, whether it's Trump with white Christians in America, or Modi with Hindus who he claims are being oppressed in India by the Muslim minority, or Orban with white Christians in Hungary, or Marine Le Pen in France, and this is really a global struggle, and it fundamentally comes down to the idea of whether a nation should be based on equality under the law, or whether nations should privilege one ethnic, religious, racial group over another.
Well put there. Nicole, I got to ask you, what is the solution to this, especially when it comes to the media? We have the First Amendment in this country. You don't regulate speech. You certainly don't regulate hate speech as you do in some European countries. Doesn't matter what Tucker Carlson says. He can't be stopped from saying it. What do we do? Do we just appeal to the Murdochs to be nicer to minorities?
Oh, well, I don't think that's going to be an effective tactic. I mean, as long as there are political incentives that make it desirable to pursue these politics, they're going to continue this way. And it's only partially a technological problem. Certainly, radicalization has been helped by Fox News as well as social media, but this is also a social and political problem. And so it has to, at least in part, be about selling that version of pluralism that Peter was just talking about versus this exclusive ethno-nationalism and fear that has been a driver not just for politics here in the U.S., but for politics, as you were talking about, all across the globe.
Tara, is it strange that at a time when the Republican Party is going full white supremacist, you actually have Donald Trump upping his margin slightly with both black men and some Latino communities in the 2020 presidential election? How do you explain that disconnect?
Yeah, I was just talking about this the other day about how Donald Trump actually increased his vote total by 22% in Philadelphia. That should be a red flag to the Democratic Party about where they are, where the disconnect is with some of their more traditional voters and why they're losing them to the Republican Party, which, as we have just explained, is taking this really ugly path toward not only authoritarianism, but this idea of white grievance. Why? What's the attraction? And I think that there's the idea of economics, the idea of having a strong leader to solve problems, and being heard. And I think that is that connection, the idea of the disenfranchised being heard, they'll cast aside some of the character flaws of leaders. And I think that's extremely dangerous. We're seeing the same thing happen with the rationalization of Donald Trump by the Christian right, by the Republican establishment at a time where he was anathema to everything that Republicans claim to stand for. And yet, because he was willing to give them potential policy wins, or he gave them rhetoric on issues that matter to them, they cast all that aside. And now they've created a Frankenstein monster. And this idea now has metastasized internationally, where there is an attack on Western-style democracy, not just in America, but all over the world. I mean, you look at what's happening in Hungary, and Hungary's not a democracy. Freedom House ranked them a 45 out of 100. That is an autocrat. And Republican conservatives are going there for a conference. CPAC is going to Hungary. Ronald Reagan is spinning in his grave.
It's clearly the American model. The American conservative model is Hungary right now. Peter, last question on a different topic, but I have to ask you while you're here. Fox News is running all day with Hunter Biden's laptop and great replacement nonsense. They haven't said a lot about a New York Times story that came out this week that reports Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally approved a $2 billion investment in Jared Kushner's new company Just weeks after the presidential son-in-law left the White House as a senior advisor, the Crown Prince overruled reportedly objections from his own finance experts. How corrupt, Peter? How concerning is this story to you? I thought I'd ask you while you're here.
I mean, it just goes to show what a lie the idea of America First is, or to go to our previous conversation, how America First only applies to certain Americans. Because an American journalist was murdered by the Saudi regime. Our own intelligence has said that. And the Trump administration gave them a pass, tried to cover it up. And now, lo and behold, Trump's son-in-law gets a huge payoff for having not held the Saudi regime responsible for the murder of an American Washington Post journalist. This is not just corruption, but it's a corruption that sells out Americans.
Well put. Jamal Khashoggi was a U.S. resident, worked for the Washington Post, and yes, there are reports that Jared Kushner helped MBS get away with it.
Can I say
Peter
something really
Beinart,
quickly
Nicole,
about that? Oh,
very
just
briefly,
really quick
Tara,
to add.
20 seconds.
Let's not forget that Jared Kushner was privy to the presidential daily brief during his time in the White House. At the same time, he was having secret meetings with MBS while he was in the White House, while MBS decided to attack his political enemies and imprison them. This was all laying the foundation for the corruption, the abject corruption of the Trump White House and Jared Kushner. It was such a disgrace to have them there. And now we see why they did it.
We'll have to leave it there. Tara Setmeyer, Peter Beinart, Nicole Hammer, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.